Hi everyone, I'm Cece Washburn from Counterfire. Great to see you all here. Welcome to Radical Chains, Why Class Matters with Chris Nineham, socialist, activist and author, and founding member of Stop the War Coalition. This session will be based on his forthcoming book, Radical Chains, Why Class Matters, which will be coming out early next year. Chris is going to speak for 20 to 25 minutes and then we'll have time for rounds of questions and discussions. So over to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Cece, and good to see everyone. Yeah, this is kind of based on a book that I've just written, thankfully, and it covers a lot of ground. The book covers a lot of ground, and I'm only going to be able to touch on some of its kind of key themes, partly because I don't want to spoil it for all of you. But the main arguments I want to put today are these. First of all, that despite the kind of deafening silence about class in the mainstream, despite a big move over the last few decades from some on the left away from issues around class, despite big changes in society that have taken place over the last 40 years, that class actually remains the fundamental, the kind of defining division in capitalist society. And that I also want to argue that alternative ways of understanding capitalism, of understanding the world we live in, which don't put class at its center, don't have anything like the explanatory power of Marxist class analysis. I also want to end by briefly trying to show the following, that though class is a real and objective and overwhelming fact in capitalist society, consciousness of class is not automatic. And indeed, full class consciousness is something that has to be fought for, that has to be campaigned for, that has to be argued for. So those are my main points. I have to say that events of the last few days have done some of my work for me. We've had 40,000 rail workers on strike, and they've pretty much brought the country to a halt. They've also, I guess, I hope, sparked a wider pay revolt. And I think they've also detonated a discussion in society about some very, very serious and fundamental questions. And therefore they've illustrated you know, the power and importance of class and class struggle in particular. I've also had unexpected help from a series of journalists, including Piers Morgan, Kay Burley, Richard Madeley, and so on and so forth, all of whose kind of crazed responses to Mick Lynch and the RMT are testimony to a deep fear and loathing that exists, I believe, amongst the media and much of the upper middle classes for the organised working class. And I think their response is partly a product of kind of shock, because for a long time now, the media and most of the middle classes have managed to convince themselves that class is a thing of the past. And it's actually one of the great paradoxes of our times that at the very moment when society has become more unequal than at any time since the 1920s, class has over the last few decades, at least until the last few days, largely disappeared from the discussion in the mainstream. I mean, you know, it's an obvious point in a way, but it's a tendency that reached its climax, I guess, in 1999 after Tony Blair led the British Labour Party into a kind of loving embrace with the free market, and when he announced the class war is over. But I think it's something that has been continued since that time, this kind of denial of class, this refusal to recognise class. And this is a strange thing, maybe, and certainly it's made stranger for me by the fact that in the last decade, for the first time in history, in 2014, according to the International Labour Organization, wage workers became the majority of the world's population for the first time. So it's a paradox. On the one hand, class has been barely talked about in the mainstream for years, for decades. On the other hand, we have this hugely divided society, almost at an unprecedented level. When you consider it, when you think about it, however, there is actually a logic to this situation. And I think the logic is this, that in order to create a society this unequal, it was necessary for the ruling class, for the neoliberal establishment, for the bosses and so on and so forth, to defeat the working class decisively, and at the same time to try and bury the idea of class. And so you saw, well, one of the things that characterized neoliberalism in the years when it was in its ascendancy in the 1980s was a very, very powerful, very, very organized class war, key sectors of the working class defeated in, you know, obviously the miners, the printers, the nurses, the steel workers in Britain, but similar defeats, similar attacks on the working class took place right across the world, actually. It's very interesting if you look at it. And this had a huge impact. And off the back of these defeats, our rulers, I think, managed to popularize to a certain extent, and I'll come on to the extent to which that happened, but to popularize the idea that class was finished, that class was old-fashioned, that the working class was no more, and so on and so forth. Now, one thing that made it easier for them was that, unfortunately, there were some people on the left, to a lesser or greater extent, who went along with this. The kind of death of the working class narrative was embraced, certainly by the leadership of the Labour Party in some ways in the 80s and beyond, as I've said, but also people further to, allegedly further to the left than Labour. And there were in the 80s and the 90s and more recently all sorts of kind of contradictory but alternative views of how society worked that avoided the question of class. There was the argument that, you know, we're in new times in which consumerism dominates over production, that, you know, people define themselves according to what they wear and shopping and so on and so forth, which was amazingly an influential argument in Britain on the left in the late 70s and early 80s. There's the argument that we're all middle class now. There's another argument more recently promoted by Guy Standing, amongst others, that we're all precariat now, or that the precariat is a new class which actually dominates under capitalism. There's other versions of it. There's an argument that we're in a weightless, production-free knowledge economy, which is fundamentally different from what we've had in the past, or that, very influential, that various forms of identity have become more important than outdated notions of class. So there's all these arguments that have been swirling around, sort of working in tandem with the basic ruling class offensive against the idea that society is divided into classes. Now, I would say that those who embrace these ideas are making two fundamental mistakes. The first one, confusing defeat and demoralization, which are subjective questions to do with organization and consciousness, for questions of objective fact. In other words, confusing the question of the actual existence of workers with the question of what the ideas are in their heads. That's mistake one. Mistake two was and remains confusing or mistaking a massive capitalist restructuring for some kind of completely new form of society. And clearly neoliberalism has introduced all sorts of, generated huge and traumatic change. But I think the prophets of new times have missed some basic points. One is that I can just touch on a few of them here, but one is that so-called service workers, who are often regarded as completely different, are actually not qualitatively different from traditional manual workers. The call centers, the offices, the shops, the hospitals, the warehouses, the schools, the universities even that people work in, more and more actually resemble factories and more organized along the same kind of lines. And more they're operating for profit. Second thing that's been missed by these theories is that there's a lot of talk about offshoring, about deindustrialization, but offshoring of manufacturing from the West, which has actually been massively exaggerated, amounts to labor displacement, not labor disappearance. And actually, if you look at the world globally, I mean, just the one thing, which is an indication, is the size of workplaces is quite astonishing when you look at the stats. you know, for all the sort of nostalgia about the 19th century, if you go back to when Engels was writing about the working class in Manchester, the conditions of the English working class in the mid-century, he was shocked and amazed at a factory of 2,000 people. The biggest factory in the world now is probably the Foxconn complex in Longertown, Shenzhen in China, employs between 250 and 300,000 people, a third of a million people in one workplace. So, you know, this restructuring the working class hasn't led to its diminishment. Actually, it's led to new forms of concentration. And that's the other key thing, I think, empirically that's being missed here, is that this massive restructuring has created huge new hubs and concentrations of workers, not just in the factories in China or other parts of Southeast Asia, but, for example, an important one, the massive transport and logistic hubs around the world that have been generated by under globalized capitalism. I mean, you see from Chicago to Chennai, from Heathrow to various places in the African continent, especially South Africa, these huge concentration of tens or hundreds of thousands of workers at the center of supply chains, which are regulated by just-in-time production and distribution regimes, and which we already know to be incredibly vulnerable to disruption. That's just one example of the way in which the reordering of capitalism in the neoliberal so-called globalized regime has actually created potential pools of massive working class power. So that's just a few empirical points. But I want to move on to this question of the establishment trying to bury the whole notion of class. And I want to say that I don't think it's surprising, because to maintain legitimacy, the capitalist class and its supporters obviously need to do everything they can to distract attention from the fact of their minority rule, to kind of to distract attention from the fact that the economics on which it is based has a fundamental conflict of interest at its heart. And I want to argue that class is not one division amongst many. It is the central, if you like, it's the dirty secret of capitalism that obviously they don't want to talk about. And that leads me on to some general points about the Marxist definition of class, because for Marxists, it's not a cultural thing or an identity. In many ways, class is invisible. It's not even mainly defined by income or by inequality, although it is important to point out the whole question of the shocking levels of inequality in capitalist society. But fundamentally, and most importantly, class is a social relation. It is generated by the central economic drive of society, the process of profit making, and that relation is quite simple, really. The fundamental relation is that the capitalist class owns the means of production. The working class has to go to work to survive. There's a dependency there, actually. And the nature of this dependency is that the capitalists put workers to work and pay them less than the amount of value they produce. And this is the source of profits. And in a way, I think it's important to recognize that one of the main reasons why the capitalists and their hangers-on get into a frenzy when class is on the table is because it threatens to expose this fact. It threatens to expose the fact that the great wealth that is amassed at the top of society is actually a product of the exploitation of the majority, that there's nothing eternal, there's nothing natural or God-given about inequality, but that the rich are rich because the poor are poor. And one of the things that Marx argues about the working class, and I think it's very important, is that because workers are the object of exploitation, they're in a unique position to understand this robbery, to understand the way capitalism works. And so, you know, it's like there's a kind of, you know, a position in society that workers have that allow them to see what's really going on in a way that other classes can't. But there's more to this, because if workers are the source of profit and they have this potential insight, they also have power. Powerless as individuals, basically. Collectively, workers, and we're seeing this right now, have tremendous power. They can bring production to a halt. the essential motor force of society can be brought to a halt only by workers. And so you have this combination of potential counterpower and at the same time insight into the system works that makes the position of workers so special. And there's one final reason why I think, one final general reason why I think class is so important, and that is that in the working class, capitalism has created what Marx called a universal class. When the bourgeoisie had their revolutions in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, they were overthrowing feudalism and replacing it with a new class society. And this was the secret to the limitations of their program and what they delivered. But workers can't do that. Workers have no interest in any exploitation or oppression. In fact, they have the opposite. They have an interest in unity and in overcoming division. Unlike any other group, workers are in a position where we can't really free ourselves without freeing all other spheres of society. You know, because of the sheer comprehensiveness of exploitation and oppression of the working class, they are a subversive force like no other. In Marx's words, they are a class which is the dissolution of all classes, a class, in short, with radical chains. So that's the case, really, for the importance of class in general, but particularly the role of the working class in the situation. Now, I want to just, in the 10 minutes I've got left, I just want to go on to the sort of obvious question, really, which I can almost hear people asking, which is, okay, this all sounds good, but if it's true, why haven't we achieved the changes that we're talking about? Why haven't we achieved the changes foreshadowed in class or class struggle? Why hasn't its potential been borne out? And I'm going to give two answers to this, which I hope are complementary and which are central to Marxism, but I think very often ignored. And the first is that despite everything I've said, the actual experience of living under capitalism for workers is contradictory. On the one hand, workers are forced together and exploited. On the other hand, they're also atomized and alienated by capitalist reality. The kind of way there's a fragmentation in the process of production that means people have a partial view a lot of the time. There's the atomization of competition. The extraction of surplus value from workers' labor is a complex process which takes place over time, and it's not fully realized until the commodities we make are sold on the market months, sometimes years after the end of the production process. So even though we produce everything, every commodity, every building, every service, in fact, produce society itself, workers can feel as if things are the other way around, as if we're dominated by the society we produce. And this sense of powerlessness and alienation, sorry, and atomization, is what Marx calls alienation. It's reinforced by ruling class ideology, but alienation, this powerless sense of powerlessness, is actually, I think, the secret of the failure of workers to fight at some points, a lot of the time. On the other hand, the other side of the reality of capitalism often kicks in. Relentless attacks on pay and conditions, bullying bosses, fire and rehire, pay cuts and so on. All of these things push us in the other direction. They push us towards organizing and fighting back. And it's more than anything the process of struggling against these kind of attacks that people learn, when people learn the real interests that they have, and they learn the real contours of capitalist society. And you can see that at the moment. I mean, the media attacks on the rail workers are absolutely outrageous, but they're also an education. They expose the fact that the media is hostile. They show that, you know, hang on a minute, it's not actually neutral. You know, we're being attacked by these people. That tells you something. It tells workers something. So that the process of struggle is very, very important. So you get the two sides of the workers' experience under capitalism. This leads me to my final point, really, which is that taking a look at the history of worker struggles in recent and further back, what you find is that even at the time of great struggles, there's a kind of battle of ideas. There's a battle of organization, because the old organizations, the old ideas, the capitalist ideas that are in our heads most of the time, although they're challenged by struggle, they're not totally overthrown. They don't disappear when struggle starts. Look at the current situation. You know, it's great these strikes have happened. They've certainly raised the stakes. They hopefully will be kicking off a pay revolt. That will have all sorts of implications. But it doesn't mean that all the workers involved are immediately turned into socialists. It doesn't mean the TUC, with all its conservatism, is not still there. It doesn't mean that Keir Starmer is no longer leader of the Labour Party and that lots of these workers will be in the Labour Party. It doesn't mean that the trade union leaders, with all their hesitancy, some of them, and their bureaucratized approach to things, have disappeared. What you see, actually, if you look back, and one of the things that I argue in the book is that there's a massive underestimation in the history of capitalism of the level of worker struggle. There's actually, it's not true that there haven't been massive revolutionary insurgent workers movements right throughout the 20th century and into the 21st. There's been, you know, it's not just the Russian Revolution we're looking back to. After the Second World War, there were huge struggles in Europe against the ruling classes. There was the wave of struggles from the late 60s through into the 70s, not just in Europe, but right around the world, affecting almost every corner of the globe. More recently, there's been the wave of struggles that are part of the history of the revival of the left in Latin America, in Bolivia, in Ecuador, and so on and so forth. It's not that there haven't been these huge insurgent struggles. The problem is that when these struggles take place, they throw up questions, they throw up an argument, they throw up strategic issues about how to take the way forward. And it's interesting, actually, if you look at all these struggles, they have been contained, they have been by and large kind of defeated, actually, historically, but mainly not by repression, mainly because the leaderships in the end of the day have capitulated to the politics of compromise and reform and haven't pushed through their advantage to the end, haven't resolved the questions thrown up by the struggle in favour of actual workers' control and workers' power. That really the political question ends up being the key question, even in great revolutionary crises and great revolutionary struggles. And this is really the argument for revolutionary organisation. It looks like we are, you know, let's see what happens, but it looks like we are once again heading into major social confrontations with the working class, despite the denials, despite all these people on the left who've written it off and so on and so forth, at its heart. But when that happens, if a revolutionary crisis, if insurgent crises start to develop in parts of the world, it's too late at that point to create revolutionary organisation from scratch. It's too late at that point to create a force that is capable in those circumstances of challenging the reformists. Because in those circumstances, the reformists will say, look, it's great you've had a general strike. This is what happened after the French strike in 1968. The reformists, the left reformists turned up and said, okay, great you've had the general strike, but let's face it, this is chaos. Go back to work. We'll sort it out for you. We'll have an election, vote for us, and we'll set you free. And there wasn't enough of a revolutionary left in that situation to challenge that narrative, to say, no, actually, what this revolutionary situation has opened up is the possibility of a completely different way of organising society, which is fundamentally more democratic than anything humankind has experienced before. And so, you know, the balance of forces politically within a crisis situation, within the great struggles, even the struggles that are happening now, the balance of forces politically between those who essentially want to conciliate and those who essentially want to push our advantage to the max is absolutely critical. And that, as I say, is the argument for revolutionary organisation and revolutionary politics. This time, we need to go into the struggle with politics and organisation that is absolutely clear and principled about the need for system change and for workers' power, because there'll be lots and lots of people, trust me, who are arguing in the opposite direction. We have to build this organisation now, in my opinion.